So it's an honor for us to host this event together with our partner, European Business Association, and Anna Derevyanka, who've been working for a number of years in implementing important reforms for the country. So, and we are very honored to have here Kurt Volker, a famous American diplomat who's done a lot for Ukraine, and not only on his in his formal capacity as a special representative on Donbass. What is little known is that Kurt also gave a lot of thoughts on how to resolve the problem of oligarchic influence in Ukraine. And his ideas on what should be the future role of oligarchy in the country, we would like to actually hear his views on that. De-oligarchization, this is one of the focuses of our organization, Center for National Resilience and Development. We focus on 4 areas. This is national security, rule of law, anti-corruption, and de-oligarchization. We believe it's actually belongs to these top 4 important for the country. When those things are sorted, then we can talk about economic policies, economic miracles, and something else, right? But those 4 needs to be addressed in order that Ukrainian and business and citizens would feel protected, and if they feel the fairness, justice in the country. So with this in mind, I propose to start, and as a warm-up, Kurt, you've been here, what is it, 18 months ago, you said? 1.5 years for sure?
Yep.
Right, which is pretty much the same, 18 months, 1.5 years. So what do you think, what do you see changed since then?
Well, I think the most striking thing from my perspective, being a former U.S. Special Representative, is the degree to which the U.S. has been absent from Ukraine. And I think that that's significant from a number of perspectives, from security, from reform, from psychological encouragement of the population, the government, etc. So I think that's one thing. Second, what does that mean that the U.S. has not been as present? Well, the United States was playing a role also of keeping Ukraine on the agenda. NATO, with Germany, with France, with Russia, so pushing the issues of Ukraine in an international setting. And if with the U.S. not doing that, I think a lot of the others go back to old habits of just moving on. As long as it's quiet in Ukraine, we don't have to think about it. And I think that's what we've seen from some of the other international partners. And in that context, Ukraine is more vulnerable than one where Ukraine is being constantly engaged and supported by an international community. So a more vulnerable Ukraine is more subject to Russian political interference, to disinformation, to military pressures, and so on. So it puts Ukraine in a difficult position. Then on top of that, you have the coronavirus, where because of the need to protect the population, significant changes happened throughout the world, throughout Europe, also in Ukraine, which resulted in shutting down parts of the economy. And so an already challenged economy faces yet another new challenge on top of that, which is the coronavirus. And that limits the options available to the government financially, limits the options available politically, and that has also created a dearth of travels. People are not traveling. You don't have the constant visitors. So it's been I don't know how else to say it. It's been a bit of a desert when it comes to the international engagement with Ukraine over the past year and a half. And that's why, you know, I'm optimistic today. I'm optimistic that with the new U.S. administration and finally getting some people into place, we have a great Secretary of State now who I know personally. President Biden knows Ukraine quite well. I think we'll see a refreshing of the U.S. engagement, and I hope that that leads to a refreshed bilateral engagement. And it's also the reason why, even at this time, I felt it was a good time to take a trip. We'll talk later about a few of the projects that I'm working on now, but I thought it was a good time to come and give them a boost.
Well, you mentioned that you felt it was a desert. Well, if you look at the administration of President Zelensky, they only seen this desert. They haven't seen anything else. Do you think they know what to expect? You know, what would be the new level of involvement of Biden administration? Do they apprehend it or not?
I think so. I think they're realistic. I think that the first thing that they would want is engagement. They want the U.S. to be supporting Ukraine. They want the top-level engagement. They want someone in the diplomatic world who's going to pay special attention to Ukraine. My understanding is that they will assign the responsibilities of a special representative to someone in the administration in an existing position. That's the model that existed under the Obama administration as well. But I think that engagement is one. The second thing, and I think it is realistic as well, is that there will be attention to the state of reform, of the fights against corruption, of steps that Ukraine needs to take for its own self-interest, to take the economy forward, to take reforms forward. And I think there will be, as usual, a combination of support for Ukraine and an insistence that there are certain things that the outside world can't do for you. Only Ukrainians can fix them themselves, and Ukrainians need to solve some of these issues. So I think that is also there as well. I think another area where I think Ukraine has expectations, and I think they are realistic again, is the continuation of substantial security assistance to Ukraine. This is something that was muted, I would say, during the Obama administration. There was a restriction on lethal defensive equipment. The numbers were not as high. During the last 4 years, those numbers went up. The restrictions on lethal defensive arms were lifted. The Javelin missiles, anti-tank missiles were provided. And I think that the Biden administration is poised to continue that. And so I think that is also going to be good for making sure that while Russia, even if it continues the war in the East, it's not going to expand the war in the East, because it would be too costly for Russia to do so.
But what in general Biden administration would mean for Ukraine? You briefly said about that, but what it could bring in detail? Because you covered the point that Ukrainians are actually in good faith in what to do in terms of our relationships with the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
But what in detail the U.S. can bring to the country?
Well, I can't speak for the Biden administration. I'm just here as a private citizen. So I can't promise what they might have as their policies or what they might deliver.
But at least your thoughts on that. Or guess.
I think that the outside observer, whether you're in Washington or Brussels or wherever, I think you're seeing that a number of the reforms that were passed during the Poroshenko era, or especially during the first year of the Zelensky administration, have been challenged in Ukraine. There's forces fighting against them now. And it's a struggle for the government to keep them on track, whether it's the land reform, or whether it is the transparency declarations, the illicit wealth declarations of members of parliament. And a lot of these things have been pushed back on by forces in society. And I think that one thing the Biden administration, the IMF, wants is to see these get back where they are supposed to be. I think also the U.S. is beginning to be more active on certain sanctions, or whether it's visa sanctions or even financial sanctions, or on some law enforcement issues concerning some of the oligarchs that are in Ukraine, pursuing investigations there. And I think the U.S. would want to feel that Ukraine is doing this too, that it needs to be something we are both working on. It shouldn't be the U.S. doing the work when we're not seeing it in Ukraine. So I think those sorts of things would be likely to be on the agenda.
But it seems that the US is more concerned about Ukrainian oligarchs than Ukrainians. Why is it so? Is it because to show off to the globe that you are their rulers in terms of the global order, or why is it so?
Well, I think one of them is where this is true. It's not true all the time, and not true in all cases. Where it is true is where the actions of some of these oligarchs have violated US laws, particularly money laundering or fraud. And then there is an interest in policing the US system. And then secondarily, where they are affecting international transactions, where the US has an interest in seeing the integrity of these institutions and transactions be maintained. So I think those are the two cases where that's true. I wouldn't say it's true in all cases, though. If it's all right, maybe I'll pivot to where my views are on this rather than trying to predict the Biden administration. But my views on this are that...
Maybe you can join in, actually, Biden administration. Who knows?
I think they have plenty of talent.
The sky is the limit.
The thing that I see, people talk about corruption in Ukraine as a problem. And yes, corruption in Ukraine is a problem. But in my view, it's a symptom more than a cause. It's a symptom of a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is a political economic structure where too few people own too much of everything. And it gives them enormous economic power, and that economic power is then used for political power and influence over judiciary, over the RADA, over law enforcement, over civil administration. It's just inevitable. And so corruption then is more of a means rather than the issue itself. And this has been the case in Ukraine really from the early days of independence. It's actually, I think, one of the defining issues that got President Zelensky elected, because he was highlighting this in his television program and saying this is one of the challenges that Ukraine has, and we have to overcome it. The difficulty is doing something about it, because if you take that as the problem, you're already then recognizing that you're starting with less power. How do we change something where it's already stacked a certain way? And my thought on this was to compare it to the situation in the United States at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. We had a handful of individuals who owned disproportionate pieces of the growing economy, oil, steel, transportation, and they were integrating these in their businesses, both vertically and horizontally, and it was distorting the economy. And they were beginning to exercise the same kind of outsized political influence that we see in Ukraine. What we did in the United States was to implement antitrust legislation, where we set limits on the amount that any one business or entity or individual could control. And by doing so, forced them to sell off assets. We broke up business empires. We sold off assets. And in doing that, we didn't take away their money. We said, sell it off, come into compliance, you keep your money, and these people became the leaders of philanthropy and foundations in the US. Now, who are we talking about? Carnegie, Mellon, Rockefeller, names that now you associate with the great, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan. You associate these with great things in the U.S. right now. But, 130 years ago, these were all black marks. If you were one of these people, it was a problem. And so we managed to do that successfully. We're very lucky, I suppose, that we did that. But I think something similar needs to happen in Ukraine. You need to focus on antitrust legislation, define what the appropriate limits are, give people time to divest, don't let them keep the money and reinvest in other areas, give them some form of, for lack of a better word, amnesty, but don't go looking back into the past, look forward if they come into compliance because the country needs it. And I think if that were to happen, it would create a demand from these very same businessmen, a demand for the rule of law. Because in order to protect the economic interests and businesses that remain, they need the rule of law to work. And I don't think that Ukraine can be successful the way we talked about, democratically, economic, and so forth, without successful businessmen. You need successful business leaders, but you need them to be able to operate in a system that sets the rules where it creates competition and rule of law.
But you are saying absolutely right. All the historical books are saying about that, things which you have said already when it comes to the oligarchs. But having listened to you very attentively, I came to the thought that you say that you have managed to eradicate completely the influence of rich people and successful people to the political decisions in the US. Or
no, just the opposite. That's my point.
Just the opposite.
And that's my point. We didn't eliminate the influence of wealthy people. We put it into a context where it's more transparent, where it is not
institutionalized,
not exercising outsized influence. It is functional. We have a new problem today, which is we have new industries that have grown the way the old ones did. So the social media empires, the tech empires, we have not come to grips with their influence in society now. And I think that is coming. I think that's something we will have to come to terms with.
Thanks. Right. So what you're describing, it looks like it was a win-win in the United States.
At the end of the day, yes,
Do you think
it
it's
was.
possible to make it win-win in Ukraine?
Not in every case, but I think overall, yes. I think there are a small number of cases where it's not redeemable. The illegal actions and the investigations into those and the international court and prosecutorial activities have already moved on. And I don't know that those are redeemable. But in most cases, yes.
But you, if I may, you're saying that basically the oligarchic structures have to behave, and they might become the philanthropists, which is the case actually in Ukraine. We have so many oligarchs, not so many, but a few oligarchs who have become already philanthropists, and but nevertheless, it doesn't. But they are lacking the antitrust legislation, this framework,
yes,
under which they could operate. But how to make it done in the situation or in the country which lacks proper rule of law? Even if you write legislation, what is the basis, or what are the leverages in order to make this legislation be implemented?
Well, it's a chicken and an egg, right? It's that you can't get the laws passed unless you get the support from some of the vested interests. But at the same time, you can't get the vested interest to do anything unless you have the legal framework to do it. So it's a chicken and an egg. But I think that, as Sasha said, it can be done because it's a win-win. For the majority of these interests, they actually will benefit from a bigger pie where they can be successful businessmen. They will benefit from being legitimized as businessmen to be able to operate internationally without the risks that are now attendant. When you think about, I want to come back to what I said with the press, but Ukraine has, I believe still today, the second lowest GDP per capita in Europe. This is crazy because it should be a wealthy country. If you look at the size of the country, the agriculture, the industry, the natural resources, the human capital, and the talent in Ukraine, it should be a wealthy country. There's nothing that should stop Ukraine from being a wealthy country. And yet it isn't. And I think it is the systemic problem. It's not any individual, it's systemic. And that's what has to be tackled. And I think if it is tackled, even the currently, you know, wealthy business leaders, invested interests, the oligarchs there, they would benefit from that kind of change. As to the how, which is what you're getting at, you know, it's difficult, of course it's difficult. What I would like to see is the US and the European Union and the IMF, why not, work together with the Ukrainian government to figure out what the rules ought to be. I think no one has actually tried to hammer out in the Ukrainian context exactly what you should be able to own in combination with other things and what you shouldn't be able to own. What's the percentage of a given market that you should have control of? Are there industries across which you've got to have a wall between those industries? I don't think that's been done. It has to be something that Ukraine leads on. You know, the outside can't come in and impose anything. Ukrainians have to do this. But then if it's done together with support from the US and the EU and the IMF, I think you can create a momentum to get it done. And then the other thing I would put into the mix, an incentive structure for the vested interests themselves, that if they comply with that kind of legislation, there's just a simple one-time tax, you pay it, you're done. If you don't comply, then you face a higher tax and perhaps nationalization or some pressure on the assets. And for disputes, I think you need an appeals court. I think that you want the Ukrainian judiciary to work. But just in case that even after it does work, it is being contested that it's somehow not fair, you need the ability to appeal to an international tribunal of some kind. And I think that's also something that the EU, the IMF, the UK, US could help put in place as, not as a court of first instance, that should be Ukrainian, but as an appeal to verify the operation of justice. I think those are some ideas.
I remember 2005, as the first time I joined the government, and I remember after Orange Revolution, the value of assets of oligarchs increased several times, only because of the expectation of a better governance in the country, eradication of corruption. Very soon it returned to the previous levels. So it just basically tells that it could be win-win. It could be win-win. Yeah. But what I would like to move a little bit away from just economics. Oligarchs is not just business, whether it's monopolized, not monopolized. It's also influencing politics. It's also leveraging media to protect or advance their interests. What would be approach here?
Yeah. This is the hardest thing, I think. What's happened, speaking about the media, what's happened globally is the internet has made the old economic model of how to produce media insolvent. You can't have the quality journalists, you can't have the television production and studios, you can't have the full print newspapers, you can't do it just on advertising and be successful anymore. It's true everywhere. I mean, look at Italy. Half the media is state-run, half the media is owned by Berlusconi. And that's because he was willing to build the empire and invest in that and subsidize it, because he had other businesses, but he's subsidizing that. Look at Hungary. There's tremendous criticism of Hungary these days for not having a free and fair and independent media. Now, I personally think it's an exaggeration, but nonetheless, let's say that's true. The main reason it's true is economic, is because it has fallen to wealthy businesses who choose to come in and buy the media and subsidize it to keep it going. And of course, once you have a media owner, then you have a media owner's editorial control. And that shapes the way the media is reporting what's happening. And in the United States, just look at our last election. You could say, you have Murdoch over here, and you have Ted Turner and Jeff Bezos over here. It's very similar. I think we do have standards of journalism in the US that we've been able to maintain better than in some other countries, but nonetheless, the economics behind it and the ownership models, we're actually not that far off from what we're talking about. So this is tremendously difficult in Ukraine, where I think it is a fair comment that almost all of the media, one way or another, has some wealthy interest behind it. And that is then protecting a certain point of view. This is the most difficult thing to figure out. You don't want to restrict free speech. You can't have regulation of content. But you also don't want media that is operating in the interest of the few when it's providing a public service. I don't have a magic wand. We haven't figured it out either. But I think this is one of the toughest ones to crack. You have to separate the media from the other economic interests and yet still have it viable.
We actually, in our center, we started to work on the roadmap for the oligarchization. So if we do it together, I know it's difficult, but how would you actually do it? Specifically, if we're talking about media, what would be, sorry for putting you in an uncomfortable position, but sometimes it's necessary.
Well, I suppose I would try to get some kind of government, opposition, civil society consensus around standards of journalism. Like what is it that separates honest journalism, separation of fact and content, verification of sources, transparency in sources, trying to get some idea of what standards are, and then having some watchdog body to police standards and create transparency in the policing of the standards so that some people get highly rated for being the best news and the best media, and some people get little red flags for saying, oh, well, this was slanted and this was slanted. But I don't know. As I said, there's no magic wand that I can think of, and I think you have to be careful about excessive state role as well. And you can't restrict free speech. So I think some kind of public understanding of standards, similar to what an American bar association does for the legal industry, that's probably what I would try to aim at.
To be actually to understand that in case you are starving, and if we have actually lots of people in Ukraine who are yet not at the proper level when it comes to wealth, it's very difficult to explain them that they need to follow the standards as such. And let me come back to the question which I raised before when it comes to the framework, win-win framework, which should be offered to oligarchs in order to trying to actually to have this win-win situation in the country. Do you think that before Zelensky, it was not offered to the oligarchs?
I honestly don't know. I only really became engaged in detailed work with Ukraine starting in 2017. I really don't know what was out there before and what was tried and not tried. My perception, however, is that the vested interests became so powerful so early on after privatization that you ended up with governments in some cases, that even governments that were trying, ended up not being focused, capable enough at implementation and less powerful than the forces they were against, that even if they had the right intention, they never really got anywhere. So that's a perception. But you would know. You were.
Yeah, well, actually, I do have an experience in this. In 2005, if audience remember, there was a big topic, hot topic, how it's called, reprivatization, right? At that time, there were public announcement that we will reprivatize like 300 companies or 600 companies. And that actually at one point of time paralyzed the economy. Because when owners don't know what's going to happen with their companies, they stop investing.
Yeah.
So at that time, actually, I was the chief economic advisor to Prime Minister, and I worked on this issue. And what we proposed at that time is that we'll take the old companies that were privatized, and we, for all of these companies, would say, you know, not individually for each company, but for all companies, 30% needs to be paid extra to the budget. And to make sure that that would sustain, the government would sign the agreement with the owners, and will introduce the clause that all litigation on that specific point will be under UK legislation, London, English law. Well, I was quite successful in promoting this idea when actually all big businesses seen that Ukraine is moving to the right direction. As soon political, vector reversed, they lost interest in dealing with the state. So basically, that teaches me the following thing: if government is serious, if government is not corrupt and really means what it proposes, then oligarchs will take it as win-win and will comply, and it will be really win-win.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's not, it will be usual way.
Yeah, it's tough.
In this case, I'm just like to ask, do you think that the current government or the current president would be able to make all necessary things and steps in order to put oligarchy into win-win framework?
You have to believe that with goodwill and reaching out to build support and alliances that you can achieve a lot. In my view, the real dividing line in Ukraine is not between the different political parties, whether it's, servant of the people, European solidarity, Holos, etc. The real division in Ukraine is between the vast majority of people who want to see a successful, democratic, prosperous, and secure Ukraine that is part of Europe, and a minority of people who still feel the social, cultural, political ties to Russia and think that should be the priority. It's a minority. I think if the forces that represent this majority of people can work together, there is a basis to get the votes, to get the political support, to get the decisions, to be able to define a course and to implement it. And I also believe that, again, with a few exceptions, I think people can guess who I might have in mind. With a few exceptions, the majority of those who have vast wealth in the country would be supportive of fixing the system because it would benefit them too, as you're saying, a win-win there.
Do you think that it will be possible?
I do think it's possible. I do think it's possible. If it's not possible, we give up now, and that's just
never
not right.
give up. Never give up.
Exactly.
Well, we at this point, given that we see some signs, on towards de-oligarchization, clearly we're seeing some progress on against Kolomoisky. Not enough, but at least some. I consider it as a first step by this administration. So I would like to ask somebody who wants to take place from representing the government. What's your view? What would be your remarks. You don't necessarily need to kind of formulate the formula, right, on delegation, but at least maybe express some views, how you see it's happening. Who would take? If nobody takes the opportunity, great. So, Kurt, coming back a little bit to the United States. Recently, there were sanctions introduced against Kolomoisky. So what's your view on this? And do you expect that the next steps, the follow-ups, needs to come from Ukrainian side, or there should be follow-up from United States side?
Well, I think, first off, it's a reflection of what I said earlier, that there is a perception in the U.S. that he was involved in some activities that were illegal in the U.S. And so there's a seizure of assets in Cleveland. There is an ongoing investigation. There's an ongoing court case in Delaware. And so the sanctions that were announced are travel sanctions, visa sanctions, which I think is consistent with that pursuit. As I said, I think there will also be an expectation that Ukraine will also do its part in investigating and pursuing where there are criminal activities in Ukraine. And it's no secret that one of the issues that has been dealt with is the Privatbank, which had basically been looted of billions of dollars of depositors' money. And then it was the Ukrainian budget, and because the IMF was supporting the Ukrainian budget, it's even US taxpayer money that went to bail out the Privatbank. And I think that's an example where there's an expectation that Ukraine will stay on track, having nationalized the bank, and keep it from paying any compensation or being restored to the previous owners, and investigating what actually happened. So I think that is a part of that. Go ahead, one more question.
Well, I think I see the following perspective. I see that now to the Biden's administration return people who remember very well 2016, how the bank was nationalized. And they view it as not only a way to save financial system from, from crash, right? They also view it as a first and maybe the only step on real de-oligarchization in Ukraine. And so when they return now, what they see is that, that oligarch have a group in the parliament. This oligarch execute his influence over courts, law enforcement, some politicians, and even started to play geopolitics. Writing some op-eds in New York Times on, that Ukraine actually needs to turn towards Russia and away from US. So obviously, I see it also as a bit, what happened?
Yeah.
Do you see it like this or not?
Not quite. It's a big deal, and it's a big deal that people remember. But I don't see it as the first step in what you said, de-oligarchization. And of course I want to recall the title that we set out for this talk is From Oligarchy to Healthy Competition. I think what's happened in the past, and this is an example, is actions in a specific case. Privatbank stole the assets, something should be done about it, we don't want to pay for this, but it's isolated. Or, okay, corruption's a problem in Ukraine, we need an anti-corruption court, let's get an anti-corruption court, now we have an anti-corruption court. But these are specific things. And I don't think we have ever, and I don't think Ukraine has ever either, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think ever anyone has sat down and said, we need to actually change the whole political economic system. It has grown into something that can't be fixed just with one step. We need to look at this holistically. And I think that hasn't happened yet, but it should happen. Can I change the subject? Are we?
Yes.
Yeah.
But
move
maybe
to
I
US
can
Ukraine
add.
relations?
Maybe
Sorry?
I can add another question, and then we can change the subject. Do you think that it's necessary to be a democratic leader in order to set up the proper framework for healthy competition, or you need to be authoritarian?
I had this discussion with Frank Fukuyama once, and I was arguing for democracy, and he was explaining to me that rule of law came long before democracy, and rule of law is what mattered more in the success of the societies than democracy. And when it's Frank Fukuyama and he's actually done his homework, you can't really argue anymore. So I do think that it's the rule of law environment is actually pretty fundamental, and it can be done in a non-democracy, but it is obviously better for the people if it's done in a democracy. That people's individual freedom and their rights, they need to be respected, and people need to have the ability to change things if they're not happy. And that's in addition to having a rule of law environment that functions. Which is a great segue. One of the things that I am doing now, so I am not a public official, I am not representing the US government or the new administration or anything, but I am working in the private sector, and I am trying to bring projects and engagement and support into Ukraine to help in various areas. And one of the ones, and the reason why I'm in Ukraine this week, is putting the final pieces together and launching an American university in Kyiv. I've seen this in other places. I have a long relationship with Arizona State University, and we are putting together a model for establishing American-style education, American university degrees, both undergraduate and graduate school, offered to students in Kyiv without having to travel abroad, and bringing in that kind of different perspective and different style of education and a Western mentality for young people in Ukraine. So it's a super exciting project. One of the things we will do after a few years is not only do engineering and science and technology and business, but also launch a medical school. And another project I'm working on and supporting is to help bring an American hospital in Kyiv as well, which we hope will bring the Mayo Clinic and Western standards in healthcare and quality and access to Ukraine as well, to be a participant in healthcare in Ukraine. And I think there's a synergy among these. And then I'm working with a few other businesses that have investments or are looking at major investments in Ukraine that will help diversify the economy, whether it's in the energy sector or whether it's in bringing a lot of jobs in the eastern Ukraine because of aviation industry and aircraft repair and overhaul. So I think that Ukraine actually has the potential to be incredibly successful, and I'm just trying to find the projects to bring here for that. And so that's one of the things, even as a non-government official now, I'm still trying to help work on.
So you're bringing money or just projects?
Well, I'm trying to bring people together with the right ideas and the right organization to produce something of bigger value.
I'm sure audience now is thinking it would be good if you bring American court here as well. With this in mind, we actually, one of the things that we're working in the center now is developing a concept for the investment court that would deal with not only with foreign investments but also with big investments also in Ukraine by domestic investors pretty much. So this is one way or another, but rule of law needs to be restored in Ukraine. Otherwise,
the question is how.
There will be no future.
The question is how to restore this rule of law.
Let's maybe again return to Ukraine-US relations. There is one topic that you've been asked this question several times today in our morning discussions. I just want to move it out of table because everybody now talks about a telephone call. I think telephone was never mentioned so many times in our press since Bell invented it. So, is it really important to talk so much about first telephone call between two presidents?
Well, I think the first thing to say is let's not overstate the importance of one phone call. Yes, it's a good thing for the presidents of our two countries to talk with each other, and yes, it's a good thing for them to give empowerment and encouragement to our respective governments and administrations to work together. But the phone call itself is really just that. And then you go to bed and you wake up the next morning, and then what? You still have all the work to do. And so I think it's important, it's valuable, and I'm also told that it is being prepared, and there shouldn't be any doubt about the relationship between the US and Ukraine. But at the same time, it's just one thing. It's an important thing, but it's just one thing amid the bigger context of the work that we have to do together. And I'm delighted that our future guest in Washington, the new Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Makarova, is here today because she's going to be carrying the burden of making that relationship work for the long haul, which is really what counts. So thank you for coming, and it's wonderful to see you, and we can't wait to have you in Washington.
Good. Do you mind if we move to Q&A at this stage?
Yes.
And Oksana doesn't like to be called an ambassador. She likes proper. So we're not calling ambassador. It's a friend and a former colleague. Oksana, would you like to start the Q&A with something that would be interesting for Court to answer and for us to? No? Okay. Who is willing, maybe you would like to take some time. Who is willing to ask a question? Please. Oksana. Gleb, будь ласка. No, use microphone.
Thank you. My name is Gleb Vishlinsky. I'm director at the Center for Economic Strategy, think tank in Kyiv. I have two questions. One question on Rinat Akhmetov and on judiciary. When I look on Anya, I recall our joint study with EBA and Dragon Capital on obstacles to foreign direct investment, and number one is lack of trust to judiciary. And among oligarchs, number one is Rinat Akhmetov. However, I could not say that on this stage.
It was not in our survey with regards to Akhmetov.
Yeah.
Judiciary, yes.
Judiciary, yeah. But the issue is that on this stage, it looks like he is not directly interested in having judiciary in the state in which it is now in Ukraine, controlled by Portnov, used in political interests, used by Kolomoisky as well. Do you see any chance of sort of splitting oligarchs by involving some of them into improving the situation with the rule of law in terms of judiciary? And the second question is also you have different oligarchs, you have the same Akhmetov, who has a lot of assets on the ground, a lot of people working for them, and you have oligarchs who are to more extent parasites, like Kolomoisky, using some different companies that are siphoning money from state-owned enterprises with corrupt schemes, etc. And when you speak about divestiture, in fact, there is nothing to divest of. When we speak about people like Kolomoisky and a lot of other people like Kononenko with previous government, etc., who were just parasites. So two questions, what to do with judiciary and how to involve oligarchs there, and the second question is what to do with parasites who do not have real assets. Thank you.
Okay, so on the first one, I said this earlier, but just to come back to it, I think that it can be a win-win. that when you establish that there is diversity of ownership and competition, it creates a demand for the rule of law, because people don't want an unfair playing field. And that, I think, is what has inhibited some of the judiciary reforms up to date, is because some oligarchs fear that, wait a second, it's going to be stacked in favor of somebody else, and I'll be the loser, and that's not fair. So they don't view the reform as necessarily truly fair. They view it as favoring one oligarch or another one, so they don't want it. The trick, I think, is to have a reform that is seen to be fair, and it has to go hand in hand with the antitrust legislation approach that I talked about earlier. But if you have that, then yes, I think that you can get many oligarchs who are legitimate businessmen, who are running proper businesses, who want to see rule of law, as long as it is applied fairly and even-handedly. And so I think that's possible. Second question, I think it's a different way of saying the same answer. You can't start from the premise, I'm not attacking your question, I'm just saying you just can't start by saying, okay, this guy's okay, that guy's a parasite. You've got to actually create the standards. Say, this is what should work in a business and an economy, and this is what should not work. You shouldn't be able to keep sending your money back and forth outside of the country to avoid taxes. You've got to, at some point, say there's a basis of your business, which is Ukraine, therefore you pay Ukrainian taxes. So I think setting the standards and then applying them even-handedly is the way to go, and then it will affect those who you call a parasite and not affect others who are playing by different rules.
But the point is, you know, that those ones who should make an order with oligarchs, and they are normally coming to the power with support of oligarchs, right? So they are paid, they are taking money for campaigns, for election campaigns, from the oligarchs quite often. What to do in order to break the cycle?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I know this is against popular sentiment here, but it's important that people have proper wages. Courts, members of parliament, supervisory boards, ministers. If people are not paid a proper wage where they feel that this is, a good livelihood for what they do for the country, then they are far more susceptible to the kind of economic bribery or pressures to say, hey, we'll give you a monthly stipend, help us on these issues, or whatever it might be. So I think allowing wages in the public sector to rise is a big thing, frankly. And I think that would, people are not inherently corrupt. People are not inherently dishonest. But when they find a situation that the system's already corrupt, the system's already dishonest, everybody else is doing other things, I'm suffering, but it's just hard for people. And so I think helping change the system where they don't face those choices is important.
Sorry, one sec. This is, please don't. We're trying to just justify behavior of certain people. It's very hard. But if you feel it's too hard for you, don't go to work for the government.
Right. Yes.
Right?
No,
because
I know.
it becomes very easy afterwards, and then you destroy your reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the question was a little bit different. How to become the president, or the political party leader or political party to come to the power in case you have no support, financial support.
Yeah, I think President Zelensky didn't win because he had one oligarch support or a different oligarch support or anything like that. He won because he understood and communicated back to the people what they wanted. He won because he said, we are going to change the system, we're going to change everything, we're going to modernize Ukraine, we're going to aim towards Europe, everything in the past has to go. That's what people wanted to hear. And I think he won because he inspired people about what is possible in Ukraine. The difficulty is that the last 2 years have shown how hard it is to actually implement that. But I think you can win if you have, you know, the right vision and support of the public, and that public support is enormous political capital.
Giovanni, 1 second. Daria, Yulia, please.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up, so.
Hello, Daria Kaleniuk, Anti-Corruption Action
Yes.
Center. Hello, Kurt. Happy to see you here.
Nice to see you.
Interesting to see your new projects in Ukraine. Very exciting discussion about the oligarchization. We are thinking about that also many years in Anti-Corruption Action Center. I think we are missing two important elements in finding the model for the de-oligarchization. What has changed since 150 years ago in the United States is that in Ukraine, oligarchs are educating their children outside of Ukraine. In London, in the US, in Switzerland, they are spending their wealth into their healthcare for themselves and for their family members outside of Ukraine, in Germany, in Austria, actually in the well-developed countries. And they reinvest the gained wealth into their developed democracies, including in the United States. On the other side, there is Russia. Additional element, the second element we are missing, which is using strategic corruption in order to boost destructive activities in Ukraine, in order to support this pro-Russian position of minority of Ukrainians, in order to support anti-Western narratives. And they are using the network of their agents, the former KGB agents planted everywhere in Ukraine. They still exist, even in the parliament, like Andriy Derkach, who participated interfering into American elections. And they find the way to throw lots of money into the activities of such people. Sometimes they collude with oligarchs, like Mr. Kolomoisky. So here, the question to Kurt. Yeah, and I'm sorry for taking so much time.
It's okay.
Do you think there will be more proactivity from the US in actually cutting the financial fuel to Ukraine from Russia for such kind of destructive anti-Western activities? And also the strategic change of policy in the US administration, not only towards Ukraine, but other developing countries, in cutting personal, wealth of oligarchs on the West. As you know, in the US, Rockefellers, they had interest to reinvest back to the US because they were living that. Thank you.
Do you mind if we take another question from Yulia? Polaska. And then your address.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Yulia Klemenko. I'm acting MP from non-oligarch party Golos, which is probably the only one in the parliament. And I would like to ask the following question. We have a vicious circle of oligarchy and vicious circle in Ukraine. When the oligarchs, they own media, it's not only TV, it's social media, it's everything around, bloggers, etc., etc. It's media empires, I would say. Then media produce politicians. Politicians coming into the government, into the parliament, and they are serving oligarchs. And they don't have any intentions or any ideas or any, thoughts to change the system. They don't need to change the system. So the problem is not in the low wages of the public servants, etc., etc. The problem in this vicious circle we are going already many years. It's 30 years already. My question is, where would you start? From media, from politicians, from government? Because we will not have judicial system if the politicians will not adopt laws and government will not implement laws because they are actually controlled by oligarchs. This is my question. Where would you start?
Right. Well, to that question, I look at the system in the US, and we have members of Congress get elected every 2 years, members of the Senate every 6 years. They have to raise money constantly in order to fund the election campaigns and pay for the media that they get in order to run for election. And so they end up having fundraising events where donors show up and give them money, and they get to talk to the congressman, and it's a way of them getting access to the congressman, which is not something your average citizen can always get. And it is a form of, I would say, regulated corruption, if you will. They raise the money, they meet with the people. But the check on this is that there are other sources of information, there are competitors, there are political opponents, there's media, so they are able to put in front of the voting public, the voters, not just what the congressman or senator would like to say about themselves, but facts, record, behavior, and so forth. And so even though we have kind of a regulated financial corruption in politics, it still works. It's still competitive because people are able to make choices based on what they can see. So turning that toward Ukraine, I don't think it'll be the first country in the world where you separate money and politics, if you do it in Ukraine. So I don't think you're ever going to get there. What you need to do is create rules and create competition and transparency. And then people will repetitively make their choices. And I think that's really the only way that works. And you'll have to remind me of the other question.
Dasha, pretty much what could US, UK, what they could do, right, in order to restrict oligarchs, right?
Oligarchs depend on the West.
Oh, yeah.
So
And
basically what
both
West
on the
needs.
Russia.
Yeah.
See? So this vicious circle is not only
Sure.
within the Ukraine.
Yeah, I think I think there are a couple of areas where we have been lax. We've allowed certain things such as Central London real estate, Miami real estate, to be used as a vehicle for people to park their money or to launder their money legally. And I think that we're aware of that, and we could probably find means to be more restrictive in the use of our own marketplaces for that. But I also want to say something about your question, or your comment before your question. Having wealth is not the problem. We need wealthy people. We need them to run successful businesses. We need them to be philanthropists and give to universities and other things. What we need is to set rules by which they can act as successful businessmen and as wealthy people legally. And if we take a populist approach and just demonize wealth, we're actually being fairly dishonest, and we're actually being fairly destructive about our own economy and what we need to be successful as a country.
3 more questions?
No, we're done. We have to go. No, I'm late already.
You're late?
Yes.
Oksana, may you ask last question?
I'll ask it by email.
Okay. But thank you all very, very much. It's been
Thank
a
you
real
very much.
pleasure to be here. And it's an honor for me to be back in Ukraine. Thank you for the beautiful painting. And I really, I want to stay committed to Ukraine and helping you as much as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.